La última comunicación que tenemos esta mañana es a cargo del profesor Paolo Sanvito de la Technische Universität de Berlín, The Change in Interpretation of the Feet Washing Ritual During the Era of Counterreformation.
Good morning. Sorry for not reading the paper in Spanish. Changes in interpretation of the feet washing ritual during the early modern era and in the era of Counterreformation. Theological interpretations of early Christian rituals in northern Italy in the time of modern devotion and later in the era of Reformation experienced a deep reconsideration of the ritual of feet washing. They pulled it up and reoriented it toward a more conscious reflection of the main Eucharistic dogmata in Catholicism. This phenomenon had backlashes on the Catholic evangelization mission in the areas of contested confessions, such as Central Europe, Hungary, or Northern Italy. The Republic of Venice and the Lombard states, Mantua or Ferrara, Milan, were some of these areas on which we are going to concentrate today. In fact, we can verify that there had never been a similar consideration of the episode of the feet washing before the period of the influential heretic movements at the turn of the modern period, with the simultaneous uprise of Wycliffism, Lollardism, the Brethren of Common Life, a part of which converted soon to Lutheranism, and Hussitism, nor there had been in Orthodox theological doctrine, as we know it from this period and its theological literature, the same attention to this episode. Quite on the contrary, a high consideration would have disconcerted the official theologians of the Church, such as Thomas Aquinas. Some early Church fathers occasionally speak about it, a circumstance which is possibly due to their closer tie to the pagan world, where the ritual of washing and anointing feet was overall spread from Babylon to the Greek oikumene. Besides, among the theologians, only Ambrose seems to have discussed the foot washing, especially in his De Mysteris. Here he states that the humankind has inherited the inclination to sin and iniquity in heels, quote, as it is expressed also in Psalms 48 and Psalm 49. Of course, the Milanese church, which is basically founded by Ambrose, the Milanese church father, was widely considered in Lombardy or in major parts of northern Italy. Also, through the contact with the earth, the feet are seen as the seat of the human affections. According to him, the poison of the serpent had in fact perverted the affectus of Adam and Eve, and has been sprinkled on their feet. In the biblical law, in Judaism, a woman was compelled to perform the ablution of her husband's feet, not as one of the other submissive gestures she otherwise had to perform, but as a love act. For the same reason, in Jewish households, it was strictly forbidden to the female slaves to wash their owner's feet. According to Cutting, this obligation is still alive in Orthodox Judaism. Earlier, the foot heel had been seen, for example, in pagan traditions, as connected to the sexual organs by means of the veins which reach from the ones to the other, as we find it also in the 5th century Fulgentius treatise, Mythologia, relying on pagan traditions. Ambrose does not need to have belonged to this very same tradition at all, but there might have been a reverberance of it in his writing, because he's still in late antiquity. In Eastern Christianity, it looks slightly differently from this point of view, and there is plenty of attention to the ritual. We even possess a hymnus of the feet washing by the Syrian diaconus and spiritual writer Kyrillonas in the 4th century. In antiquity, the washing of someone's feet and the anointment was a semantic vehicular of religious and social order at the same time. It constituted just one layer of the guest's greeting or of their welcoming. The guest, who was interpreted as a divine herald since archaic antiquity, basically had to expect it regularly. Origen of Alexandria goes much further than Ambrose when he confirms in his Homiliae in Genesim that Dominica sacramenta non nisi in lavandis pedibus consumanda sint. The sacraments of the Lord cannot be performed without the ritual of the feet washing, with a clear hint to the closeness of the pedilavi mysterium, the mystery of the washing of the feet, which is a mystery, and the sacrament Eucharist. He says, Origen of Alexandria, straightforwardly, only after the pedilavium, the hagion pneuma, the Saint Spirit, resided in the disciples, and they had become pure for God. Beforehand, they were pure only for humanity. To the purity of the disciples' feet refer also the sentence by St. Paul, quoted by Ambrose, of course. I quote, "Beautiful are the feet of those who come to announce the eternal peace," in the letter to the Romans. And Paul relies on Isaiah 52, I quote, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the one bringing good news, announcing peace, bearing good news, announcing salvation," end quote. Now to the scenes. Many scenes of the pedilavium, feet washing, together with or in the context of Eucharistic Christological narratives in the cycles of Christ's life, found an expression in the writings by members of the Augustinian order, which on their turn were closely related to the Dutch and Flemish modern devotees. This phenomenon increases during the late Middle Ages, or at the turn to the modern era. One of the first and most relevant examples is the successful Augustinian monk and devotional writer Pietro Bernardini da Lucca, who is active in the whole of northern Italy, also in his illustration engravings, which he included in the printed works. I'm not going to analyze all of them now, otherwise it would take us too long time. Very beautiful Renaissance prints. Similarly to Pietro da Lucca, also Serafino Aceti de Porti, also called da Bologna, was a great mediator of the heritage of Northern and German mystics such as Johann Landsberger's Carthusian monk, Faretra Divini Amoris. In this work, translated into Italian by Serafino and spread all over the European provinces where Italian was read or understood, one chapter is against the weak faith or tepidità of faithfuls, against which the preachers and the Orthodox doctrine in general were directed. But the power of faith is seen by him as reinforced by the feet washing ritual. In fact, the ritual, as illustrated by Pietro in his Regole della Vita Spirituale, presents it as the antidote to the danger of atheism, of heresy, of lukewarmth of faith, also in explicit engravings illustrating. In some pages, he asserts that the faithful always constantly needs to wash their feet or having them cleaned to purify them from the venial sins. The necessity of washing the sins by washing the feet, the venial sins, which are not the worst, of course, the ones which are inherited, basically. According to such interpretations, even the apostles in the gospel narration are said by Pietro da Lucca as having had in their feet the affetti sensuali e sordid, e però, quanto a quelli, avevano bisogno di abluzione, and therefore they needed to be cleansed, which corresponds to stating that impure feelings or sins were resilient in their feet, instead of in their brain, as modern interpretation could tell. Numerous passages in Pietro's work are dedicated to this problem and its solution. In other forms, the same theory recurs another time when he speaks about the necessity of the ritual to clean the affezioni dell'anima, in this case. In such devotional interpretation, there appears to be an exaltation of the ritual of the Pedilavium and its relevance. It is presented in a way in which it fulfills some essential part in elevating, mystically or non-mystically, and purifying the souls, in a similar way to the role played by the Eucharist. Besides, the Orthodox Catholic doctrine of theology seems here to have been put in the background, or to have gone ori, if we really take literally what we read in the mystical literature. If we went back to the decisive explanation in John 13, in John's Gospel, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. End quote. This explanation is clear about the ordinance given by Christ to the faithful, with the institution of the feet washing. The disciples and all the rest of his followers should. The verb is opheilo, which is a very strong obligation word. Should repeat and continue this gesture or activity in the church on a regular basis, as a strong seal of fellowship or relationship to one another. Being the gesture of touching someone's feet to a certain degree, at the same time intimate and devout, of course, it strengthened the emotional fusion among the early members of the church. On the other hand, the accent upon the sanctity of the receiver of the ritual was evident. In this way, the stress on the relevance of the ritual might have found sufficient justification among theologians from early modern Italy at large, even if not completely orthodox. But all we can find in the gospel text is what I read. However, instead of dismissing all the alternative visions as too pagan or related to the Oriental Church and therefore dangerous for the official Roman doctrine, in the time of Reformation, there seems to have existed an integration of pagan or archaic cultural dimensions. Through this remains hidden in only part official literature. The feet of the apostles, or of Christ in the episode of Magdalene's anointment are seen as a symbol or a link between the underworld, which made them dirty, dark, and dusty, and that's why early modern painting between Italy and Spain always stresses this point, not as a critic to the body dimension, but as a symbol of the need to purify oneself, like in just one of the very numerous examples we could choose. It is a link between the underworld, which makes the body dirty, dark, and dusty, and the spiritual world, respectively, the human and the divine kingdom, on the other hand, to which Christ promises to transport the disciples via feet washing. By this means, they receive an attention which they had never experienced in art before the early modern era. This leads us to a number of considerations with regard to the very peculiar diffusion of this specific iconographic subject in Italian or Upper Italian art and their vehement representation. In many oeuvres of influential painters such as Girolamo Romanino, Tintoretto, Alessandro Moretto, among the frequent representation of Eucharistic images, we find also the numerous one of the feet washing or the barefooted apostles, with an evidence which we cannot clearly, logically explain. Accordingly, they are all related to such marginal non-official interpretations and ultimately to the harsh debate about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist during this period, or about the related dogmata, which after 1519 and beyond, the reformers had installated into Italy, especially into Milan and Venice, or into other Catholic regions as well. Some syncretistic representations of the supper in Emmaus and feet washing look just awkward, because there is no clear link between the one and the other, of course. From a logical point of view, they don't make sense, maybe only from the spiritual point of view. The peregrination to redemption cannot be performed with any kind of shoes to paradise. It requires nudity and separation from any material comfort, as we read in an originally Greek mystical text, Climachos, Johannes Climachos, Scala Meditationis, which was very much read in the northern Italian provinces, where we find a chapter della vera e santa peregrinazione, l'essere di continuo peregrini e forastieri in questo mondo, la superna e celeste patria amando e desiderando. In Moretto or Romanino, 2 minutes. In fact, humility and the feet washing are present in his frequent use of the supper in Emmaus as a typus in the medieval sense of the Eucharist. Some scenes are a hybrid between foot washing and supper. I showed enough of these syncretistic representation. How to explain them? Is the accent on the bodily dimension of the scene a tool for involving the faithful and keeping him distant from the evangelical temptations? Commissions from Orthodox circles can be very extreme exactly in the same sort of the idolatry of images, which all the reformers had been condemning in the same period, especially at the beginning of their evangelizing activity. Like we could observe in Gaudenzio Ferrari and Giovan Battista della Cerva, two Lombard painters, And the last one was Lomazzo's teacher. His pupil, Giovan Paolo Lomazzo, was going to be soon very ingenious in inventing extravagant iconographic formulas against the Catholic Counterreformation and finding their most fitting justifications in his writing. I skipped the examples from the Central European cultural circle, and I come to the last examples, of which one of the most celebrated is here in the Prado. Tintoretto seems to have been really fond of the subject. The question we should address is whether the strict turn initiated by the Council of Trent had a backlash on the freedom of this representation, or representations of the naked underparts, such as legs and feet. In Tintoretto, we constantly have the impression it is not only about the narration from the Gospel, but also it is a pagan ritual. And so on and so forth. I'm not going to analyze all of them. Many other paintings by him also refer to the Magdalene episode. And this swaps into the entire Titian and Tintoretto school from northern Italy, which is a large deal of followers. And I come to conclusion. A high esteem for the significance of the feet-washing ritual seems to find a strong parallel in the arts of Spain, or in commissions by clergymen from Spanish and Portuguese dioceses. And this is no wonder, being many of the artists taken to Spain by clergy and dynasts from Lombardy. From a global perspective, it might be recorded that even Buddhism, after the 6th century and rooting in earlier Hinduistic traditions, knew the feet ablution as a means to purify somebody's negative karma and achieve the body presence of a Buddha. Of course, there is no connection between the aforementioned Catholic rituals and Buddhism. It is only worthwhile mentioning that both cultural milieu prove having a sensible perception of the feet as a body part related to the dichotomy purity/impurity, a kind of excess in interpretation of the evangelical material, including the accounted rituals of welcoming or honoring the guest, which I have been trying to demonstrate today, might be the most reliable method of understanding much of the mentioned paintings and their patronage background. However, art historical and iconographical scholarship has so far neglected it. Thank you for your attention.